London, 1850. Imagine the fog curling through gas-lit streets, the rattle of carriage wheels, and the muffled sound of boots on wet cobblestones. It was an age of telegraphs, railways, and iron bridges, yet alongside all that progress, life was bound in threads of regulation so peculiar, so oddly specific, that the Victorians sometimes seemed less like citizens of a mighty empire and more like participants in a vast social experiment in obedience. This was a time when you could build a machine that crossed continents, yet be fined for sliding on ice in the wrong street, when you could oversee an empire stretching across oceans, but scandal followed if you kissed your wife at a train station, when children climbed inside smoking chimneys while grave inspectors measured the depth of coffins to make sure they were sufficiently underground. A world where freedom was constantly measured, weighed, and judged. Why? Because for Victorians, order wasn't just desirable, it was sacred. In their eyes, the strength of the empire depended on regulating appearances, curbing temptations, and punishing behavior that hinted at disorder. Laws became less about crime and more about shaping morality. And in many ways, this mirrored older civilizations. Ancient Rome policed morality with leges sumptuarii, sumptuary laws that dictated how much silk you could wear at a banquet. In medieval Christendom, church decrees banned dancing on feast days. Each era left behind its rules, but the Victorians elevated regulation to an art form, a public ritual of control. Their obsession with rules also carried whispers of something deeper. To the historian, these laws reveal more than eccentricity. They show fear. Fear of bodies out of control, of streets too chaotic, of women too independent, of the poor too unruly, of progress moving faster than morality could keep pace. Like the priests of Babylon who read omens in the stars, Victorian lawmakers read danger in laughter on a Sunday or in a woman's flushed face after a bicycle ride. To them, these weren't trivial matters, they were signs that society might be cracking. At the same time, new sciences and half-sciences emerged to justify restrictions. Doctors invented conditions like bicycle face. Magistrates treated novels and bawdy songs as poisons as dangerous as gin. Churchmen thundered against Sunday leisure as if happiness itself might summon the devil. Even graveyards became laboratories for regulation, as if 6 feet of soil could contain not just corpses but the fear of disease, decay, and ghosts. When you examine these laws, you're not just looking at statutes, you're looking at how Victorians interpreted the world. Archaeologists dig ruins to find lost cities. Historians comb archives for vanished empires. Psychologists trace the hidden archetypes in myths. In a way, each law is its own artifact. It tells you what people valued, what they feared, and what they wanted to control. They reveal a culture as anxious about morality as the Egyptians were about the afterlife, as protective of purity as medieval crusaders were of Jerusalem. That is why these laws are fascinating. They are absurd, yes, but also profound. They show us the double life of Victorian Britain. Progressive on the surface, repressive underneath. They show us how control often masquerades as common sense. And they invite us to question our own world. What are the rules we obey today without noticing? What will future generations laugh at in our legal codes? Over the course of this story, we'll wander through 12 peculiar areas of Victorian law. Each one will bring us face to face with contradictions, moments where morality clashed with pleasure, where science blurred with superstition, and where compassion existed for animals before it did for children. We'll hear of the Sabbath that outlawed joy, of obscene publications that courts said could corrupt the most susceptible, of women detained by police doctors under the Contagious Diseases Acts, of chimney boys shoved into flues despite laws meant to protect them, and of coffins measured by tape to ensure death itself was properly administered. This isn't a parade of curiosities. Each statute connects to deeper currents in philosophy, psychology, and power. Think of the hidden structures of Freemason lodges, the suppressed manuscripts of the Vatican Library, or the myths of Atlantis used to explain the lost and forgotten. Victorian laws, too, were ways of controlling narratives, of defining what could be seen, said, and done. The historian's task is not only to recount them, but to interpret them as symbolic acts. For example, consider the ban on furious driving written into the Metropolitan Police Act. On one level, it's just traffic regulation for horse-drawn carriages. On another, it is the empire attempting to discipline speed itself. The law about indecent bathing costumes, a clash between ancient notions of ritual purity and modern desires for leisure. The vaccination laws that provoked riots, a case of state medicine colliding with older fears of bodily invasion, not unlike medieval panics about witchcraft or demonic possession. And always beneath these regulations, there lingers the ghost of conspiracy. Why were women policed more harshly than men? Why did moral guardians care so much about controlling pleasure? Were these laws really about health, or were they about ensuring that power stayed firmly in the hands of those who wrote the rules? The Freemasons, the Vatican, the Reform Societies, the Leagues for Temperance. Victorian Britain buzzed with organisations, many semi-secret, all lobbying to shape society in their image. To understand these laws is to glimpse the machinery of influence, the hidden hand guiding public morality. This story is not just Victorian, it echoes. The way laws are written, enforced, and later remembered is a form of historiography, deciding what future generations will know about us. Sometimes laws survive only in satire, like the infamous hat tax, which by Victoria's reign was already gone but lived on in memory as an emblem of absurd state interference. Other times they leave direct scars. The burial acts that transformed London's landscape still shape cemeteries today. The vaccination debates still echo in our own age of public health arguments. So tonight, as you settle back and let the words carry you, we will wander together through a Britain both familiar and strange. A Britain where progress and repression walked hand in hand. A Britain that wanted to conquer the world, yet trembled at the sight of a kiss on a railway platform. Each part of this journey will bring a new regulation to light, explain its purpose, reveal its consequences, and show how it connects to the broader patterns of human history, psychology, and myth. Let the lamplight flicker, let the fog roll in, and let the streets of Victorian England open before us. Not just streets of stone and smoke, but streets patrolled by rules, laws, and the constant surveillance of propriety. These laws may seem laughable now, but they once carried real consequences. They defined how people lived, loved, worshipped, and even died. And as we explore them, perhaps we'll glimpse something unsettling, that beneath the absurdity lies a truth about control, fear, and the fragile balance between freedom and order. Welcome, then, to the Empire of Rules. The Sunday Lockdown Lord's Day Observance. If there was one day of the week that showed the Victorian obsession with control more clearly than any other, it was Sunday. The Lord's Day, as it was officially styled, was not just a spiritual pause in the week, but a stage where morality was enforced with startling rigidity. The roots of these laws ran far back, centuries before Victoria ever took the throne. But in the 19th century, Sabbath restrictions became a battleground between two forces: those who believed joy itself was a form of sin, and those who saw leisure as a right, especially for the working poor. The central piece of legislation here was the Lord's Day Observance Act of 1780, but it was in the Victorian period that it reached its most stringent enforcement. This law prohibited public entertainment, limited alcohol sales, and effectively declared the seventh day a national hush. Theatres were dark, music halls silent, museums locked. Even the London Zoo, a supposed institution of education and scientific curiosity, found itself hauled into controversy when it dared to open its gates on a Sunday. Critics claimed that even giraffes and elephants should not become accomplices to sin. For the wealthy, Sundays were tedious but tolerable. They had private gardens, carriages to ride in, and drawing rooms where quiet dinner parties could slip beneath the radar of the law. But for the working class, the men and women who toiled 6 days a week in soot-choked factories, Sunday was the only day free. And yet it was a freedom strangled. No beer at the tavern, no kickabout in the park, no song in the street. Instead, the expectation was hours in church, followed by long afternoons of silence, scripture, and stern self-reflection. Children were expected to sit upright, hands folded, eyes cast down. Laughter itself was suspect. This strange suspicion of joy has parallels across history. In ancient Babylon, festivals were strictly controlled by priestly calendars, a reminder that time itself belonged to the gods. In medieval Europe, guilds could be fined for holding feasts on forbidden days. The Victorians, inheriting both Puritan severity and Anglican formality, crafted their own version of sacred time, guarded not just by priests, but by police. The Sabbath laws became less about worship and more about surveillance, turning every neighbor into a moral inspector. Anthropologists often point out that human cultures create liminal days or spaces, times when ordinary life is suspended. Festivals, carnivals, and holy days break the routine. But in Victorian Britain, Sunday was the reverse. Instead of joy breaking through, it was joy that was barred. The liminal time became a cage, and this cage was justified by the fear that one unruly Sunday could unravel the moral fiber of the entire nation. The absurdity of this double standard becomes clearer when you look at who suffered most. In Manchester or Leeds, mill workers staggered out of factories after 6 days of monotonous labor, desperate for leisure. A museum visit might have been both educational and restorative, but laws said no. The working poor had to spend their one free day under the same discipline that ruled the other 6. The wealthy, meanwhile, circumvented the restrictions in subtle ways. Private gatherings, estate walks, carriage rides outside the city. Once again, law became not just about holiness, but about class. Resistance did grow. The National Sunday League, founded in the 1850s, campaigned for museums and libraries to open on Sundays, arguing that education was not sinful. Their opponents, the Lord's Day Observance Society, countered with fiery pamphlets and sermons, warning that even a single Sunday cricket match might signal the collapse of civilization. The debates filled newspapers, pulpits, and even Parliament, where MPs wrestled with whether a pint of ale on the 7th day was a moral disaster or simply refreshment. This clash also reveals a profound psychological element. Sigmund Freud would later write about the superego, the internalized voice of authority that turns desire into guilt. Victorian Sunday laws functioned as a kind of collective superego. The day itself became a ritual reminder that personal pleasure was dangerous, that control of the body was the highest form of virtue. Jungian psychology would interpret this as shadow projection. By condemning laughter, play, or drink, society externalized its fear of chaos, projecting it onto everyday activities that had to be stamped out. Symbolically, the Sabbath laws also echo ancient religious patterns. In astrotheology, Sunday is the day of the sun, a symbol of light, vitality, and life. Yet in Victorian England, that light was dimmed. Instead of celebrating the solar force, it was restrained, muffled, and turned into a long ritual of suppression. The paradox is striking. The very day linked to brightness became the greyest of the week. And yet, cracks appeared. In 1855, when London Zoo opened on Sundays, thousands flocked to it, hungry for something other than pews and sermons. Critics wailed that the public would rather stare at giraffes than read the Bible, but the very success of the experiment proved how desperate people were for variety. Railway companies began to lobby for Sunday trains, arguing that workers should be able to visit families outside the city. Even the quiet act of strolling through a park became a small rebellion against the hush imposed by law. From a historiographic perspective, the Sabbath restrictions show how laws are remembered differently depending on who tells the story. For church records, the observance preserved morality. For working-class memoirs, Sundays were remembered as prisons of boredom, days when time slowed to a crawl. One diarist wrote that childhood itself seemed suspended on Sundays, as though the day refused to move. In this way, the same law produced two different histories, one of supposed virtue, one of lived misery. Comparative religion also sheds light. In Judaism, the Sabbath was a joy, a time for feasting and family. In Eastern traditions, holy days often included music, incense, and celebration. But the Victorian Sabbath was stripped of joy, reduced to discipline. It reveals how Christianity, filtered through centuries of Puritanism, had mutated into a system where absence of pleasure became the highest sign of faithfulness. By the late 19th century, the pressure finally began to ease. Museums cautiously reopened, parks filled with quiet strollers, even pubs found ways to skirt the rules with private clubs that technically weren't selling beer, but sharing it. As with many Victorian laws, enforcement waned as reality asserted itself. The desire for joy could not be legislated away forever. The larger lesson? The Sabbath laws show us that Victorian society feared freedom more than sin. A pint of beer, a laugh in the street, or a visit to the zoo seemed small, but to moral guardians they were terrifying symbols of autonomy. And in the end, that is what control always fears most. Not crime, but freedom. So the next time Sunday feels a little quiet, remember this. In Victorian Britain, joy on a Sunday could make you a suspect. The law did not just measure behavior, it measured happiness, and happiness to them was a dangerous thing. Street nuisances. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1839. If you had wandered the streets of London in the 1840s, you would have noticed more than fog, gas lamps, and the bustle of horses and carts. You would have found yourself under the invisible gaze of a new legal net, the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839. On the surface, this law seemed like a rational attempt to bring order to a rapidly expanding capital. But when you look closely, its details reveal something stranger. It transformed ordinary, often harmless acts of daily life into offences. This was the law that criminalised furious driving of carriages, sliding on ice in public places, flying kites in the streets, ringing doorbells without reason, and even singing bawdy songs where others might hear. It read less like a set of serious crimes and more like a parent's rulebook for unruly children. And yet it was very real, complete with fines, arrests, and magistrates ready to pass judgment. Why did such trivial acts attract legal attention? The answer lies in the state of London itself. By the 1830s, the city was bursting at the seams, the population had surged past 2 million, streets were crowded with vendors, beggars, entertainers, carts and animals. For elites, this chaos was terrifying. Disorder in the streets was not just inconvenient, it was seen as a sign that the moral order of the empire could be slipping. A man sliding on the ice was not simply a man having fun. To the lawmakers, he was a symptom of unruliness, a citizen refusing discipline. This way of thinking has precedents. In ancient Rome, street laws regulated festivals, processions, and even who could wear certain clothing in public. The message was always the same: control the visible, control the society. In the Middle Ages, guild ordinances fined apprentices for singing lewd songs in alleyways, and in Victorian London, the Metropolitan Police Act carried forward that long tradition of turning everyday behaviour into a question of morality and authority. One of the most striking parts of the law was its obsession with noise. Obscene ballads, shouting in the streets, even certain kinds of music could be policed. On one hand, this reflects a genuine concern. Crowds could gather quickly in narrow lanes, and riots were never far from memory. But on another level, it was about silencing voices that disrupted the image of a respectable, orderly city. Street singers, many of them poor, used bawdy songs to mock the powerful. By criminalizing their performance, The law suppressed a form of folk resistance. Anthropologists would call this the policing of ritualized misbehavior. Every society has its safety valves, festivals, jokes, satire, ways to release tension. But Victorian elites were deeply anxious about giving the masses any outlet that looked uncontrolled. Instead of carnival, they preferred silence. Instead of laughter, sermons. And this fear was not just about class, it was also about politics. The 1830s and 1840s were decades of unrest, Chartist, protests, strikes, riots in industrial towns. The ruling classes worried that even a playful crowd in London could tip into rebellion. To them, a kite in the wrong street or a crowd cheering a singer was not harmless, it was potentially revolutionary. The law became a tool of preemptive control. From a psychological perspective, this is fascinating. Depth psychology tells us that societies often project their fears onto minor acts. The Jungian shadow of Victorian London was the unruly crowd, the mob that haunted the nightmares of parliamentarians and bishops alike. Rather than confront their fear of political collapse, they codified rules against childish play as if controlling games could control revolutions. But there's another layer, symbolism. Consider the ban on sliding on ice. Ice, unstable and dangerous, symbolizes freedom that can slip beyond control. The image of children laughing as they skid across frozen puddles might look innocent, but to moral guardians, it was chaos made visible. Or think of the ban on ringing doorbells wantonly. It wasn't just about annoyance. A ringing bell was a disruption of domestic sanctity, the invasion of the private sphere. To protect the home, the sacred Victorian symbol of order, they criminalized the prank. Archaeologists of the future might read these laws as artifacts of anxiety. Just as excavating a ruined city reveals what a people feared, fire, invasion, famine, the Metropolitan Police Act reveals what Victorians feared in their own capital: laughter, spontaneity, visible disorder. Yet for all its strictness, enforcement was uneven. A wealthy boy caught flying a kite might be scolded, a poor boy might be fined. Historians note how police discretion became a form of class control. The same act could be tolerated in Mayfair and punished in Whitechapel. In this sense, the law was less about universal morality and more about reinforcing hierarchy. Secret society researchers often point out how laws function like coded rituals, signals of who holds power. Just as the Freemasons used elaborate rules to reinforce belonging, Victorian lawmakers used petty offences to remind the poor that they lived under constant watch. To break even a minor law was to risk confrontation with authority. It was a daily reminder of who was in charge. The Act also reveals the way history is written. In legal records, these offences appear as footnotes: arrested for furious driving, fined for obscene ballad. But behind each phrase was a human story, a cabman rushing to earn fares, a singer mocking the hypocrisy of elites, children playing in winter. These stories were erased by the way the law framed them. What survived was the voice of authority, not the voices of those silenced. This is historiography in action, the way official memory privileges control over experience. There were critics, of course. Some journalists mocked the act as overreach, lampooning the idea of inspectors measuring children's kites or scolding boys for sliding. Cartoons in Punch magazine poked fun at the law's absurdities, portraying policemen as overzealous busybodies. But humour did little to change reality. The law remained on the books and street order remained a priority for decades. Looking back, the Metropolitan Police Act feels almost comical. Who today would imagine being fined for sliding on ice? And yet the principle behind it is chillingly familiar. Modern laws too often criminalize minor acts, loitering, jaywalking, minor public disturbances that fall most heavily on the poor. The Victorian obsession with street order was not unique. It was simply one episode in humanity's ongoing struggle between freedom of movement and fear of disorder. So as you picture those foggy streets, imagine the unseen hand of the law pressing down on the most ordinary of actions. A boy hesitates before ringing a bell. A singer lowers his voice. A cabman reins in his horse. All not because their acts were dangerous, but because they unsettled the fragile illusion of order. The empire that spanned continents was, at its heart, terrified of a child's laugh echoing down the wrong street, obscenity by the most susceptible, the 1857 Act and the Hicklin test. By the middle of the 19th century, London bookstores and print shops were overflowing. The printing press had become cheaper, literacy was climbing, and a hunger for words spread through every class. Novels by Dickens and Thackeray, poems by Tennyson, pamphlets of political reform, all found their way into eager hands. But along with respectable reading came something the authorities found alarming. Erotic pamphlets, racy illustrations, and bawdy ballads passed from hand to hand. In 1857, Parliament decided enough was enough. They passed the Obscene Publications Act, the first law in Britain specifically targeting obscene books, images, and prints. On the surface, it looked straightforward. Police could seize and destroy works deemed indecent. But the real impact lay in how obscenity was defined. 11 years later, in 1868, a legal case called Regina v. Hicklin gave judges a standard that would echo for more than a century. The Hicklin test declared that any material which could deprave and corrupt those open to such immoral influences was obscene, regardless of whether most adults would consider it offensive. The key phrase was, "those open to influence." In practice, this meant children, servants, and women, groups the courts considered most vulnerable. Imagine that for a moment. A book could be banned, not because of how the average reader saw it, but because a magistrate thought it might be too shocking for a servant girl. Victorian censorship was built not on actual harm, but on hypothetical corruption of the most susceptible. Here lies the first strangeness. By trying to protect innocence, the law actually policed imagination. It assumed that certain people lacked the moral strength to resist ideas. In doing so, it created a legal system where the state decided what you might think if exposed to a story. The law was less about books and more about minds. And what did they ban? Some were explicit works of pornography, yes, but others were not. Even medical texts about anatomy could be seized if a judge thought they revealed too much. In one infamous case, pamphlets advocating contraception were destroyed as obscene, even though they were meant as practical guides for family planning. To Victorian moralists, controlling reproduction was almost as scandalous as sexual pleasure itself. History shows us that censorship has always been about more than morality. In ancient Athens, certain plays were banned when they mocked political leaders. In Rome, works deemed heretical were burned. In the medieval period, the Vatican placed books on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The Victorian era carried this long tradition forward, but with a peculiarly modern twist, it framed censorship as protecting the vulnerable. That framing allowed it to look compassionate while exercising power. Psychology adds another angle. Carl Jung argued that societies project their shadows, their unacknowledged desires, onto scapegoats. In Victorian Britain, the shadow was sexual curiosity. Instead of admitting it was universal, they projected it onto servants, women, and youth, claiming these groups were uniquely corruptible. Thus, by banning books, the authorities acted out their denial, insisting that purity was possible if only certain words were never read. There's also the symbolism of the written word itself. Across cultures, writing has been seen as sacred. The Egyptians guarded hieroglyphs, medieval monks illuminated manuscripts, mystics encoded their secrets in ciphers. Words were powerful and power must be contained. The Obscene Publications Act fits into this ancient pattern. It wasn't just about stories, but about controlling symbols. In a sense, the Victorians treated obscene texts as cursed scrolls, objects that carried dangerous energy. Destroying them was an act of ritual cleansing. At the same time, the law sparked resistance. Underground publishers flourished, smuggling risque prints from France and distributing them secretly. Just as prohibition in America created speakeasies, Victorian censorship created hidden markets. One London police inspector admitted that the more they seized, the more demand grew. In other words, the Hicklin test backfired. The forbidden became more desirable because it was forbidden. From a historiographic perspective, the Obscene Publications Act also shaped how later generations remember the period. We often picture the Victorians as prudish and joyless, but that image is partly a result of censorship itself. The legal system erased much of the erotic, playful, or rebellious material from public view, leaving us with a skewed archive. It's not that Victorians lacked desire, it's that their laws tried to erase the evidence. And yet, censorship was never consistent. Wealthy collectors sometimes escaped scrutiny, hiding banned works in private libraries. Meanwhile, poorer printers and sellers bore the brunt of enforcement. The law became another tool of class power. A racy French novel in a nobleman's study might be tolerated. The same book on a street stall in Whitechapel could bring arrest. When we connect this to conspiracy and secret society studies, the parallels are uncanny. Just as the Freemasons or Rosicrucians guarded secret knowledge from outsiders, Victorian law positioned the state as guardian of moral knowledge. Only approved stories could circulate, forbidden ones had to be kept from the unready. It was a secular echo of religious secrecy, dressed in the robes of morality. What makes the Hicklin test especially fascinating is its long reach. This Victorian invention shaped British and American law well into the 20th century. Even in the 1950s, US courts used the Hicklin test to justify seizing books like James Joyce's Ulysses. A standard born in Victorian fears about servants and children shaped the censorship of modern literature. That is the power of a legal definition. It can outlive its creators by a century or more. Looking back, we might laugh at the idea that reading about contraception could corrupt the masses. But the larger point is serious. The Obscene Publications Act reveals how a society can dress control in the language of protection. It reminds us that whenever the state claims to defend the vulnerable, we should ask, who decides what counts as protection and who benefits from the restriction? So imagine again those London bookstalls. Among the novels and newspapers, hidden pamphlets pass from hand to hand. A printer risks arrest. A servant risks dismissal if caught reading. A magistrate sharpens his pencil to condemn yet another obscene work. And in the shadows, desire refuses to be silenced. The empire could ban words, burn books, and police imaginations. But it could never fully erase the curiosity that made those books so appealing in the first place. The State versus Sex Work, the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1864, 1866, 1869. Among all the peculiar regulations of Victorian Britain, few reveal the imbalance of law, morality, and gender more starkly than the Contagious Diseases Acts. Passed first in 1864 and expanded in 1866 and 1869, these laws gave police sweeping powers to stop and detain women they merely suspected of being prostitutes. Once detained, the women were forced to undergo medical examinations, often invasive and humiliating, to check for venereal disease. If found unclean, they could be confined in a lock hospital for months or even years. Men, of course, faced no such inspections. The official reasoning was practical. Britain's army and navy, vital to the empire, were plagued by high rates of syphilis and gonorrhea. Disease was weakening the troops, reducing fighting strength, and costing the state money. Parliament's solution was not to regulate soldiers' behaviour, but to police women's bodies. A prostitute was treated not as a person, but as a potential infection, a walking hazard to national security. Think of the irony: an empire that conquered continents trembled not at foreign armies, but at the possibility of its own soldiers being incapacitated by disease caught in a garrison town. And rather than addressing the men's conduct, lawmakers decided to criminalize women's existence. This is the heart of the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that dressed themselves as medical reform but were in truth mechanisms of control built on fear of female sexuality. For the women subjected to them, the experience was degrading. Imagine being stopped on the street by a constable, accused of being a prostitute simply because you were poor, alone, or dressed a certain way. You had no right to refuse examination. Doctors could order you onto a table, instruments in hand, as part of a legal medical check. Consent was irrelevant. Humiliation was inevitable. If you tested unclean, you were locked away in a hospital until cured, which could mean months of isolation and painful treatments with mercury. The acts sparked a storm of controversy. Women reformers, led by the remarkable Josephine Butler, launched what became one of the first organised feminist campaigns in British history. Butler argued that the laws were not just unjust but barbaric, turning poor women into scapegoats while allowing men complete immunity. She toured the country giving speeches describing the surgical rape of the examinations and gathering support from working-class communities who recognised the cruelty at work. Anthropology helps us understand why the state focused on women. Across cultures, societies often treat female sexuality as the frontier of control. From Babylonian temple codes to medieval canon law, women's bodies were policed as if they held the key to social order. The Victorians inherited this pattern but applied it with modern bureaucracy, lists, police powers, and hospitals. It was ancient patriarchy updated with the machinery of the state. There is also the symbolism of disease itself. Victorians feared venereal infections not only for their physical harm, but for what they represented: hidden corruption, secret sin, the collapse of moral integrity. In their imagination, disease spread like moral contagion, and so they projected this fear onto women, casting them as carriers of pollution while ignoring men's role entirely. Depth psychology would call this projection, placing the shadow of desire and guilt onto another group to preserve one's self-image. Comparative religion offers another lens. In Jewish purity laws, menstruation and bodily emissions were treated as ritually unclean, requiring separation. In Hindu traditions, women were sometimes sequestered during periods of impurity. The Contagious Diseases Acts echoed these ancient purity codes, but under the guise of medical science. A Victorian lock hospital was not a temple, but functioned in much the same way. It marked women as unclean and confined them until they were judged pure. Critics at the time saw through the hypocrisy. Pamphlets pointed out that the acts effectively licensed prostitution. If soldiers could not be controlled, the state would ensure a clean supply of women for them. Far from eradicating vice, the law institutionalized it. This paradox became a rallying cry for reformers. A law claiming to protect health was in fact legitimizing exploitation. The resistance movement spread quickly. Butler's Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act gathered petitions with thousands of signatures, unprecedented for women at the time. She linked the fight against these acts to broader questions of liberty, asking why the government claimed the right to invade citizens' bodies. Her arguments resonated not only with feminists but also with liberals who feared unchecked state power. By the 1880s, after years of relentless campaigning, Parliament finally repealed the laws. From a historiographic point of view, the story of the Contagious Diseases Act shows how law is remembered not only for what it did, but for the struggles it provoked. Today, we study these acts less for their immediate effects and more for the movement they ignited, the birth of a feminist politics that connected bodily autonomy to freedom. The women who resisted were not simply protecting prostitutes. They were defending all women from the state's presumption that their bodies could be inspected, controlled, and confined. And yet, echoes of this struggle persist. Modern debates over surveillance, public health, and sexual morality still carry the same question. How far can a state go in the name of safety? The Victorians justified invasive examinations as a matter of national defence. Today, similar language appears around other policies, always invoking the greater good, always asking individuals to surrender autonomy for security. The lesson is clear. The language of protection often hides the reality of control. There's also a ghostly quality to these laws. Paranormal folklore tells us that spirits often haunt places of trauma. In some garrison towns, people still whisper of the women confined in lock hospitals, their stories buried with them. Whether literal ghosts or simply the weight of memory, these tales remind us that law leaves scars. A statute may be repealed, but the experiences it inflicted live on in cultural memory, haunting us like restless spectres. Imagine then the streets of Portsmouth or Chatham in the 1860s. A young woman walks home, clutching her shawl against the wind. A constable steps forward, suspicion in his eyes. She is taken, examined, confined. No crime committed, no trial held, only the presumption that her body is a threat. That was the reality of the Contagious Diseases Acts. And for decades, it was lawful. The absurdity lies not just in the injustice, but in the imbalance. An empire that celebrated freedom, that claimed to spread civilization, was at the same time imprisoning women without charge. A society that boasted of morality institutionalized hypocrisy. The Victorians may have thought themselves rational, but here their laws reveal something else, a society terrified of its own desires, punishing the powerless to preserve the illusion of order. Compulsory needles, the Vaccination Acts of 1853 and beyond. Few Victorian laws stirred as much passion, fear, and resistance as those surrounding vaccination. In 1853, Parliament passed the Vaccination Act, requiring all infants in England and Wales to be vaccinated against smallpox within the first 3 months of life. Parents who refused faced fines, and repeat offenders could even be imprisoned. What seemed on the surface like a straightforward medical reform quickly became a lightning rod for debates about liberty, science, and the power of the state over the body. To understand the intensity, we need to step back. Smallpox was one of history's great killers. Ancient records from Egypt describe outbreaks. Rome was ravaged by it. Whole populations in the Americas were devastated after European contact. By the 18th century, Europe had turned to inoculation, deliberate exposure to a small dose of the virus, as a crude form of protection. Then came Edward Jenner, who in 1796 discovered that exposure to cowpox granted immunity to smallpox. His method, called vaccination, from vacca, Latin for cow, spread rapidly across Europe and beyond. By Victoria's reign, it was hailed as one of the greatest medical triumphs of the age. But making it compulsory? That was new. The 1853 Act was the first law in the world to require a medical procedure for all citizens. And here lies the strangeness. A law that turned a private decision about a child's body into a matter of state. Parents who refused weren't just considered negligent, they were treated as lawbreakers. The law was extended in 1867, raising penalties and requiring vaccination up to age 14. The backlash was immediate. Across industrial towns and rural villages, people formed anti-vaccination leagues. Pamphlets accused the government of poisoning children, of conspiring with doctors to profit from fines, of violating the sacred bond between parent and child. Public meetings drew thousands. Effigies of vaccinators were burned. The cry was not simply no to needles, but no to tyranny. From a psychological perspective, the anger makes sense. Carl Jung once wrote that the body is the most personal of all symbols. It represents the boundary of the self. When the state claimed the right to pierce that boundary with a needle, it triggered primal fears. Parents felt stripped of agency. The needle became not just a medical instrument, but a symbol of invasion, of state control reaching literally under the skin. Anthropology adds another insight. Across cultures, rituals involving piercing or blood are sacred. Think of circumcision in Judaism or scarification in African societies. These acts mark belonging, identity, and submission to communal authority. In Victorian Britain, compulsory vaccination carried the same symbolic weight, but without ritual meaning. Instead of the family or faith community, it was the government that marked the child's body. Small wonder it provoked resistance. The controversy was also fueled by the science of the time. Germ theory was still emerging. Miasma, the belief that disease spread through foul air, was widely accepted. Vaccination seemed magical, even suspicious. Some parents feared it might transmit animal traits, imagining children sprouting cow-like features. Caricatures in pamphlets depicted babies with horns or tails, grotesque illustrations of what might happen when animal matter entered the human body. To us, they seem absurd, but they reflect the deep unease of a society caught between old beliefs and new science. The law's enforcement was harsh. Vaccination officers visited homes demanding proof of compliance. Parents who resisted could be fined repeatedly, pushing many working-class families into poverty. In some cases, children were seized and vaccinated by force. This heavy-handed approach only strengthened resistance. By the 1870s, riots erupted in towns like Leicester, where thousands marched against compulsory vaccination. The Leicester anti-vaccination demonstration of 1885 drew more than 20,000 people, carrying banners that proclaimed liberty over compulsion. Historiographically, these protests are fascinating. On one hand, they are remembered as obstacles to medical progress, a tragic delay in the eradication of smallpox. On the other, they are remembered as early expressions of civil liberty, warning of the dangers of unchecked state power. Both views are true. The law saved lives, but it also revealed how fragile trust in authority could be when consent was ignored. The echoes of this Victorian conflict still reach us. Modern debates about vaccination, whether during the polio campaigns of the 20th century or the COVID-19 pandemic, repeat the same questions. Who decides what happens to our bodies? Can the state compel action in the name of public health? How do fear, rumor, and distrust shape compliance? In some ways, the arguments of the 1850s never ended. They simply changed vocabulary. Comparative religion provides another perspective. In Christian thought, baptism marked a child as belonging to the faith community. In compulsory vaccination, some Victorians saw a parody of baptism, an unwanted initiation into the Church of Science. Joseph Campbell might have called it a ritual without myth, a symbolic act stripped of spiritual narrative, leaving only the coercion behind. And what about conspiracy theories? They flourished. Pamphlets accused the government of hiding vaccine deaths, of plotting population control, even of secretly weakening the poor. In this, the anti-vaccination movement mirrored the language of earlier centuries, when plague outbreaks were blamed on witches, Jews, or foreigners. Whenever fear grips society, conspiracy fills the gaps left by uncertainty. Symbolism studies also highlight the role of the cow. The very word vaccination tied human survival to an animal. To Victorians steeped in biblical imagery, this was unsettling. The golden calf was a symbol of idolatry. Pagan rites often involved bulls or cows. For some, injecting cowpox into a child blurred the line between human and beast, purity and corruption. The fear was not just medical but mythic. Over time, compromise arrived. In 1898, after decades of unrest, Parliament amended the law to allow a conscientious objector clause. Parents who swore before a magistrate that vaccination violated their beliefs could refuse. It was one of the first times in British law that conscience was recognised as grounds for exemption. The idea would echo in later debates about military service, education, and healthcare. The story of the Vaccination Acts is not simply one of science versus ignorance. It is a story about how laws touch the deepest parts of human identity. Health, freedom, belief, fear, each collided in the figure of the needle. For the state, vaccination was about survival of the nation. For parents, it was about survival of autonomy. Both sides were right, and both sides were wrong. Picture a mother in Leicester cradling her infant as the officer knocks at the door. She believes the vaccine may harm her child, but she also knows refusal could mean fines she cannot pay. She feels trapped not by disease, but by law. In her mind, the state has become another illness, one that infects her life with anxiety. That moment, multiplied across thousands of homes, shaped an entire generation's view of authority. The lesson is unsettling. Progress, when forced, breeds resistance. Even a life-saving measure can become a symbol of oppression if imposed without trust. The Victorians thought they were conquering smallpox with law. Instead, they uncovered a truth about human nature. Freedom, even when dangerous, is cherished more fiercely than safety when it comes with chains. Children in Flues, the Chimney Sweeper Acts, 1840, 1864, 1875. Of all the laws of Victorian Britain, few capture the contradiction between morality and practice more than the Chimney Sweeper Acts. On paper, these laws were meant to protect children from one of the most dangerous occupations of the 19th century, climbing inside narrow chimneys to scrape soot from the flues. In reality, for decades, they amounted to little more than words, ignored by employers, overlooked by inspectors, and endured by countless children whose childhoods vanished in smoke and ash. By the early 1800s, the image of the child chimney sweep was already infamous. Small boys, some no older than 6, were forced into flues barely wide enough for their shoulders. They wriggled upward in pitch darkness, scraping soot with bare hands, their lungs filling with black dust. Burns, suffocation, twisted bones, these were everyday risks. The medical world even identified a unique disease, soot wart, a form of cancer that struck sweeps with cruel regularity. And yet, despite the horror, the trade thrived because machines for cleaning chimneys were seen as unreliable. A human child was flexible, cheap, and expendable. The first serious attempt at reform came with the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840. It set the minimum age for sweeps at 21, an absurdly high figure that showed lawmakers knew full well that children were still being used. By setting the bar so far from reality, Parliament was essentially admitting that almost every sweep in Britain was breaking the law. Enforcement was practically non-existent. Employers simply called their apprentices volunteers or ignored inspectors altogether. 2 decades later, another act in 1864 reduced the legal working age to 10. In theory, this should have ended the use of very young boys. In practice, it changed little. 10 was still far too young for the dangers of the job, and many masters falsified records or bribed officials. Inspectors, when they did appear, sometimes brought measuring rods to check if a child was small enough to fit certain flues, as if the issue was one of size rather than safety. It was a bureaucracy that measured children not by dignity, but by chimney width. The final reform came in 1875, when after years of campaigning, the Chimney Sweepers Act made it illegal for anyone under 16 to work as a sweep, and finally gave police real authority to prosecute offenders. By then, mechanical brushes had improved, and public outrage had grown too loud to ignore. Yet for decades before that, countless children had lived and died in flues, sacrificed to the demand for clean hearths. From an anthropological perspective, this trade reveals something deeper. Societies often tolerate cruelty when it is hidden in the service of comfort. Families wanted warm fires. They did not want to see how those fires were made safe. The child in the chimney was out of sight, just as the poor in workhouses or the sick in asylums were tucked away. As long as soot was cleared, society looked the other way. The symbolism is haunting. Fire in myth is both sacred and dangerous. Prometheus stole it from the gods. Vesta guarded it in Rome. To the Victorians, fire was domestic, contained in the hearth, the symbol of home. But to keep that fire safe, children were sacrificed like offerings into its mouth. Each child sweep was, in a sense, a ritual victim to the hearth god of Victorian respectability. The law, weak and ignored, became part of the ritual, an incantation that soothed conscience without changing reality. Depth psychology would suggest another layer. Carl Jung wrote of archetypes of the sacrificial child. the innocent offered up to preserve the order of society. In the sweep's case, the archetype became literal. The community's safety from chimney fires was bought at the cost of a child's health. Lawmakers, employers, even parents participated in this unconscious myth, cloaking cruelty in necessity. History also shows the hypocrisy. This was the same society that founded the RSPCA in 1824 to protect animals from cruelty, decades before a similar society was formed for children. A donkey beaten on a street could bring a fine. A boy suffocating in a chimney often brought nothing but silence. This inversion of priorities reveals how morality in law was shaped not by compassion, but by convenience. Campaigners like Lord Shaftesbury fought tirelessly to end the practice, publishing reports, gathering testimonies, and shocking the public with illustrations of children trapped in flues. His work is a reminder of how social reform often depended not just on laws, but on relentless pressure to enforce them. Without activists, the Chimney Sweeper Acts would have remained dead letters, written but never lived. Archaeology adds an eerie perspective. Some old houses in Britain still carry traces of the trade, tiny handprints in soot, scraps of cloth lodged in flues, even bones of children who became stuck and never came out. These remnants are not just material artifacts, they are silent testimonies to a legal system that allowed suffering to persist long after it claimed to ban it. Historiography, too, plays a role. Victorian memoirs sometimes romanticized sweeps as cheerful figures, the ragamuffins of folklore who whistled through soot. This sentimental lens sanitized the truth. Only in reform literature and medical reports do we glimpse the brutality. The law's failure was not just in enforcement, but in memory. By painting sweeps as plucky, society excused its own complicity. Comparative history reveals parallels. In ancient Rome, children were sometimes used in mines too small for adults. In medieval guilds, apprentices bore the heaviest labor. In each case, law lagged behind cruelty, and reform arrived only when the suffering could no longer be denied. The Chimney Sweeper Acts were part of this long arc, evidence that progress in compassion is always uneven, always contested. By the late 19th century, mechanical brushes and stricter enforcement finally removed children from chimneys. But the story lingers as one of Victorian Britain's strangest contradictions, a society that prided itself on moral order, yet allowed children to be shoved into burning flues. Laws existed, but without enforcement they were ghosts, present in name, absent in power. Picture it. A foggy London morning, the clatter of hooves outside, smoke curling from rooftops. Inside, a small boy climbs into a chimney, brush in hand, body trembling. The master waits below, shouting encouragement or threats. Neighbours know what is happening, but the law does little. The fire crackles safely that evening in the drawing room, but the cost is a child coughing in the dark. That is the reality behind the Chimney Sweeper Acts. The lesson? Laws without enforcement are illusions. They soothe conscience, but change nothing. And sometimes the very existence of a law allows society to pretend it has acted while cruelty continues in plain sight. In Victorian Britain, children were not protected by these acts. They were measured, ignored, and consumed by fire. Taxing companionship, the dog tax of the 1860s. Among the more unusual burdens of Victorian life was a law that put a price not on land or trade, but on loyalty itself, the dog tax. By the mid-19th century, keeping a dog in Britain came with a government fee, and failure to pay could result in fines or confiscation. It was one of those laws that looked practical on paper, yet revealed deep truths about class, morality, and the uneasy relationship between people, animals, and authority. The tax itself was not entirely new. It had existed in different forms before Victoria's reign, but in the 1860s it became particularly visible. Officially, its purpose was to reduce the number of stray and dangerous dogs roaming cities. London, Manchester, and other industrial towns were crowded with half-starved mongrels, scavenging for scraps and sometimes spreading rabies. The government argued that by charging a license fee, only responsible owners would keep dogs, thereby thinning the population of strays. But for ordinary families, especially the working poor, the tax was devastating. A dog was not a luxury. It was a guard for the home, a companion for children, sometimes even a working partner for labourers or shepherds. To force payment for this bond felt like punishing affection. Imagine finally saving enough to feed and care for a scruffy mutt, only to have a tax officer knock at your door demanding money or threatening to seize the animal. The result was heartbreaking. Many families abandoned their dogs to avoid the fee. Streets filled with strays, the very problem the law claimed to solve. Others tried to outwit inspectors, hiding dogs indoors, walking them only at night, or insisting they were cats or farm animals exempt from the tax. There are even records of people disguising their dogs with makeshift coverings to pass as sheep or goats. Pet ownership became a clandestine act, tinged with the thrill of illegality. From an anthropological perspective, the tax touched something primal. Dogs had been humanity's companions for millennia, guardians in the night, partners in the hunt, symbols of loyalty in myth and religion. To put a fee on that bond was more than financial, it was sacrilegious. It turned a sacred relationship into a transaction. In many cultures, the dog was seen as a guide to the afterlife. Think of Anubis in Egypt or Cerberus in Greece. The Victorians, by contrast, reduced the dog to an entry in a ledger. The symbolism is stark. While horses associated with wealth and status were celebrated, dogs associated with the poor were taxed. This reinforced class hierarchy. The wealthy could parade pedigreed hounds, while the poor struggled to keep a single mongrel. It was not simply about animals, but about reminding the lower classes that even affection could be regulated. Depth psychology helps explain the cruelty. Jung might say the dog represents the archetype of the faithful companion, the instinctual self that follows us with loyalty. By taxing dogs, the Victorian state symbolically taxed loyalty itself, asserting power over the most intimate bonds of life. It was as if the government was declaring, even your closest friend is ours to regulate. The inspectors who enforced the tax were widely hated. Much like modern parking wardens or meter readers, they became symbols of petty tyranny. They patrolled neighborhoods, counting dogs, checking licenses, and sometimes confiscating animals. For poor families, these men were villains, tearing away beloved companions in the name of law. Satirical newspapers portrayed them as dog catchers with nets, scouring alleys like hunters of happiness. The cruelty extended beyond humans. With so many dogs abandoned, towns resorted to mass culls. Strays were rounded up and killed, often in brutal ways. A law meant to bring order ended up causing misery, not only for families, but for the animals themselves. It was a reminder that regulation, when detached from compassion, can multiply suffering instead of easing it. Comparative history shows parallels. In ancient Rome, there were taxes on slaves and luxury goods, but not on dogs. Companionship was left free. In medieval Europe, church tithes covered land and livestock, but dogs were rarely taxed. The Victorian dog tax stands out as uniquely callous, a modern attempt to commodify loyalty. Resistance grew. Animal welfare activists, emboldened by the earlier success of the RSPCA, founded in 1824, criticized the law as cruel and counterproductive. Newspapers carried stories of hungry dogs wandering streets, of children weeping as inspectors led their pets away. Campaigns began to push for reform, arguing that companionship was not a luxury to be taxed, but a basic human good. The dog tax also reveals the Victorian tendency to confuse morality with money. To own a dog without paying the fee was not just illegal, it was seen as irresponsible, even immoral. Respectability was measured not only by behavior, but by compliance with financial rules. A licensed dog was a respectable dog, an unlicensed one was a sign of disorder. Once again, appearance mattered more than reality. From a historiographic angle, the memory of the dog tax lingers, less in legal texts than in cultural resentment. Oral histories and memoirs recall it as a symbol of government overreach, one of those laws people laughed at bitterly long after it ended. Its very absurdity ensured it became part of the folklore of Victorian bureaucracy, proof that no aspect of life was too small to regulate. There's even a ghostly undertone. Paranormal folklore often features phantom black dogs roaming the countryside, omens of death or guardians of thresholds. In Victorian Britain, abandoned dogs really did haunt the streets, gaunt, spectral, wandering in packs. For those who believed in omens, these strays must have seemed like living symbols of a society that had betrayed its most loyal creature. The irony is sharp. Queen Victoria herself adored dogs, surrounding herself with beloved pets at Windsor. The aristocracy bred and displayed pedigreed animals in shows that became fashionable events. Meanwhile, working-class families were fined for keeping a single scruffy companion. It was a society where affection was a privilege of the wealthy and a liability for the poor. Eventually, pressure mounted. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the tax was reduced and enforcement softened. But for decades, it stood as an emblem of how far the Victorians were willing to extend their mania for regulation. Even loyalty, even companionship could be priced. So picture it, a child in Manchester hugging his dog, a mutt with ribs showing as a tax inspector raps on the door. The family cannot pay, the dog is taken. Outside, the streets echo with the howls of abandoned animals. Inside, another lesson is learned, that in Victorian Britain, even love came with paperwork, modesty in wool, bathing laws and the seaside police. The Victorians loved the seaside. Doctors recommended sea air as a cure for tuberculosis, melancholy and nearly every ailment in between. Railways made coastal resorts accessible to the growing middle class. Families poured into Brighton, Margate, Blackpool and Scarborough, eager for a taste of leisure once reserved for the elite. And yet, as with so much in the 19th century, pleasure was never free of regulation. Even swimming in the ocean came with laws, rules so elaborate and strange they sometimes turned seaside holidays into exercises in obedience. At the centre of it all was the Victorian obsession with modesty. Bathing laws were not about safety or cleanliness, they were about ensuring no inch of flesh caused scandal. For women, regulations required bathing dresses, full woolen outfits with sleeves to the wrist, collars to the chin, and skirts down to the knee or longer. Stockings and bathing shoes were often mandatory. The result was a heavy, waterlogged costume that could weigh more than 10 pounds when soaked. For men, the rules demanded suits that covered the chest and extended to the knees. The sight of a bare torso was considered indecent, a threat to public morality. To enforce these, codes, seaside towns hired beach inspectors, sometimes nicknamed the Seaside Police. Their job was to patrol the sands, measuring hemlines, checking sleeves, and ensuring that bathing costumes complied with local bylaws. Offenders could be fined or ordered off the beach. Newspapers recorded cases of women ejected for showing too much calf, or men reprimanded for rolling down their sleeves in the summer heat. It was modesty under surveillance, enforced not just by glares from fellow bathers, but by law. Perhaps the strangest contraption of all was the bathing machine. These were small wooden huts on wheels that could be drawn into the sea by horses. Women would enter fully clothed, change into their heavy bathing dresses and then step directly into the water from the hut, hidden from the gaze of strangers on shore. Some machines even had canvas screens that extended into the sea, creating private enclosures. The idea was simple. No one should ever see a respectable woman in her bathing costume on land. Only once immersed in water could modesty be preserved. It sounds comical today, but to Victorians this ritual had symbolic weight. The bathing machine was a liminal space, a threshold between the respectability of land and the transgression of water. Stepping from one to the other required a ritual of concealment. Anthropologists might compare it to rites of passage, where transitions are carefully managed to avoid chaos. For Victorians, the chaos they feared was visual exposure, the possibility that desire might be sparked by an ankle or an elbow. From a psychological perspective, the laws reveal the projection of anxiety. Jung described how societies externalize their fears onto symbols. Here, the body became the symbol of danger. By covering it with wool and patrolling it with inspectors, Victorians believed they were containing not only scandal but desire itself. The absurdity, of course, is that repression often magnifies the very thing it seeks to suppress. The more the law obsessed over hemlines, the more erotic power the exposed ankle acquired. Comparative history shows that such anxieties were not unique. In ancient Greece, athletes competed naked in the Olympic Games, celebrating the body as divine. In contrast, medieval Europe enforced strict codes of modesty at public baths, where men and women were often segregated. The Victorians pushed modesty to new extremes, blending religious morality with bureaucratic enforcement. It was as if they believed civilization itself could unravel at the sight of bare skin. Symbolically, the wool bathing dress carried another irony. Wool was associated with warmth, hearth, and domesticity, hardly the fabric of the sea. By forcing women to enter the ocean wrapped in wool, society symbolically tethered them to the domestic sphere, even as they sought leisure. They could never fully escape into the freedom of water. The weight of expectation literally dragged them down. Archaeology leaves traces of this culture. Surviving bathing costumes preserved in museums look less like swimwear and more like prison uniforms. Stiff collars, heavy skirts, and decorative trimmings show how fashion collided with law to create outfits almost hostile to the act of swimming. Some bathing machines also survive, tiny huts that look quaint today, but once carried immense social weight. They are material witnesses to a time when leisure was policed as strictly as labor. Resistance did emerge. By the 1890s, younger women began pushing back against the restrictions, shortening sleeves and raising hemlines for practical reasons. Men, too, began peeling off their tops, scandalizing inspectors. Local councils fought bitterly over whether to relax the rules. One town might ban bare chests, while another tolerated them. Newspapers debated whether society could survive the shock of seeing more skin. Spoiler: it could. But the very fact that so much energy was spent on the question reveals the intensity of Victorian anxiety. There is also a conspiratorial layer to the laws. Some critics at the time accused councils of using morality as a cover for profit. Bathing machines were rented for a fee, and regulations ensured their necessity. By banning women from appearing in costumes on shore, towns guaranteed a steady income from machine rentals. What looked like modesty may also have been economics disguised as virtue. Comparative religion adds yet another lens. Water, in many traditions, is a symbol of rebirth and cleansing. Baptism in Christianity, ritual baths in Judaism, ablutions in Islam all mark water as sacred. But Victorian seaside laws stripped water of its sacred freedom, turning it into another stage for regulation. Instead of rebirth, it became a performance of restraint. The sea, vast and untamed, was domesticated by wool and law. Historiography, too, has shaped how we remember this. Today, the bathing machine has become a quaint symbol of the Victorian seaside, often romanticized in postcards and museum displays. But behind the nostalgia lies a harsher truth. These devices were not whimsical novelties, but tools of control. They remind us that even leisure, even laughter at the beach, was shadowed by authority. Picture it: Brighton, 1875. The shore is lined with bathing machines, horses pulling them into the waves. Inspectors patrol with notebooks in hand, eyes sharp for any slip of fabric. Families cluster under parasols, whispering about the scandal of a man rolling up his sleeves. A young woman, shivering under layers of wool, steps into the sea, the weight dragging her down. Around her, laughter is cautious, freedom carefully rationed. This was the seaside underlaw. The larger lesson is clear. Victorian bathing laws were never really about safety. They were about appearances, about controlling desire by controlling sight. They remind us that law often serves as theatre, performances of order meant to reassure society that chaos is under control. But in truth, no inspector could stop the tide, no bathing dress could erase desire, or the sea remained vast, untamed and indifferent, washing over human anxieties like sandcastles at the shoreline. No pints after hours, licensing laws and the war on alcohol. If there is one thing governments throughout history have consistently tried to control, it is how and when people drink. The Victorians were no different. Their licensing laws turned a pint of beer into a battlefield between morality, profit, and survival. In an age of long working hours and limited leisure, the pub was often the only refuge for factory hands, miners, and dock workers. But to lawmakers and reformers, the sight of men crowding taverns after dark looked less like relaxation and more like the unraveling of society. The roots of this obsession went back centuries. As early as the 18th century, Britain had weathered the gin craze, when cheap spirits flooded the streets and entire neighborhoods seemed drunk from dawn to dusk. The chaos led to early restrictions on production and sale. By Victoria's reign, the memory of gin-soaked anarchy haunted lawmakers. They sought to tame alcohol not just through taxation but through strict regulation of when, where, and how it could be sold. The result was a labyrinth of licensing rules. Pubs could only open during certain hours. Sundays brought especially harsh restrictions. Many taverns were forced to close entirely or operate only for a few hours in the afternoon. Serving after hours was illegal, and police patrolled to catch violators. For working-class men whose shifts often ended late at night, this meant staring longingly at locked doors, the barrels inside untapped, while officers stood guard. The irony was obvious. A man could spend 12 hours in a factory inhaling soot, but heaven forbid he sought a pint after 11 p.m. That, according to law, was a threat to moral order. And the restrictions didn't just apply to men. Women seen in pubs were stigmatized as immoral, and children were barred from entering. The pub was reshaped by law into a narrowly defined space of respectable drinking, though respectability was always measured by middle-class standards, not by the lives of those who depended on ale to dull their exhaustion. Enforcement led to some of the era's strangest stories. Police raided pubs at midnight, sometimes catching landlords serving beer in teacups to disguise the offence. Customers gathered in back rooms with curtains drawn, whispering over pints like conspirators. In some towns, landlords kept a boy posted outside to signal if officers approached. Drinking became less about leisure and more about subterfuge. In fact, the tighter the restrictions, the more inventive people became. This gave rise to what might be called the Victorian loophole culture. Pharmacies sold medicinal tonics that contained more alcohol than most ales. Bottles with names like Nerve Restorer or Elixir of Vitality promised health but delivered intoxication. Because they were classified as medicine, they could be sold freely on Sundays or after hours. Housewives who might never set foot in a pub could buy a bottle of tonic from the chemist, sipping gin disguised as remedy. It was a society where legality depended less on what you drank than on what label was pasted on the bottle. Anthropology helps us understand this dynamic. In many cultures, alcohol has been ritualized. Greek symposia, Roman feasts, medieval ale houses. Each setting carried rules, but those rules were usually communal, not imposed by the state. The Victorians broke with this tradition by making the state the arbiter of when pleasure was allowed. Drinking became not just a social act, but a legal performance, timed by the clock and overseen by police. Psychology reveals another layer. For reformers, alcohol symbolized chaos, loss of control, indulgence, danger to family order. By regulating drink, they believed they were taming the shadow side of society, but in suppressing it so harshly, they pushed drinking into secrecy, which only magnified its allure. The forbidden pint sipped behind closed curtains tasted all the sweeter for being illegal. The symbolic weight of Sunday restrictions is especially revealing. To lawmakers steeped in Christian tradition, the Sabbath was sacred, a day for prayer and restraint. Alcohol was cast as its opposite, worldly, indulgent, corrupting. Closing pubs on Sundays was framed as defending holiness, yet for workers, Sunday was their only day of rest. To deny them leisure felt less like moral guidance and more like theft. No wonder resentment brewed. The law turned the day of rest into a day of deprivation. Historiographically, these licensing laws shaped how later generations saw Victorian society. To us, the idea of police measuring pub hours seems absurd, almost comical, but to contemporaries it was deadly serious, tied to debates about family stability, crime, and the strength of the empire itself. Newspapers reported arrests for after-hours drinking alongside stories of theft and assault as if they were equally threatening. The law blurred the line between genuine crime and ordinary leisure. Conspiracy theories inevitably followed. Some accused brewers of colluding with government to protect profits by keeping competition limited. Others believed the church pushed restrictions to keep men in pews instead of taverns. Still others suspected that police used licensing laws as an excuse to harass working-class communities while turning a blind eye to wealthy gentlemen's clubs where alcohol flowed freely behind closed doors. Comparative religion adds yet another perspective. In many traditions, intoxication has been both sacred and feared. Dionysian rites in Greece celebrated ecstasy. Islamic law forbade wine as a danger to purity. The Victorians stood uneasily between these poles, fearing drink, yet unable to let it go. Their solution was not abstinence but regulation, an uneasy compromise that satisfied no one. Archaeological traces even hint at this culture. Excavations of Victorian pubs reveal hidden back rooms and cellars with multiple exits, perfect for evading police during raids. Bottles labelled as medicine but clearly containing strong spirits turn up in refuse heaps. The material record confirms what the laws themselves tried to deny. People always found ways to drink. By the end of the century, temperance movements gained momentum, calling for total prohibition. Groups like the Band of Hope taught children to pledge lifelong abstinence. Yet even they struggled against the stubborn fact of human desire. Total prohibition never came in Britain, but the licensing laws remained a daily reminder of the state's hand in ordinary pleasure. Picture it, a worker leaving the factory at midnight, pockets full of soot, throat dry with exhaustion. He walks to the pub, but the door is locked. Through the window, barrels sit untapped. A policeman watches from the corner. The man sighs, turns to the chemist, and buys a nerve tonic. Swallowing the fiery liquid with a grim smile, law has triumphed on paper, but desire has found its way, as it always does. The lesson is not simply about alcohol, it is about the limits of control. The Victorians believed morality could be legislated by the clock, that chaos could be contained with licensing hours. What they discovered instead is that law can reshape behavior, but it cannot erase desire. In trying to make society sober, they only made it sly. The hat tax legacy, policing fashion and foreheads. Few things capture the strangeness of Victorian regulation like the hat tax, a law that quite literally turned fashion into taxable property. While the tax itself was first introduced in the late 18th century, its enforcement and cultural aftershocks persisted well into the Victorian era, shaping how people dressed, how they signalled class, and even how they feared the knock of an inspector at the door. The principle was disarmingly simple. Every hat sold in Britain had to carry a government-issued stamp glued inside the lining. Shopkeepers selling hats without this stamp faced heavy penalties. Buyers caught wearing unstamped hats could also be fined. It was, in effect, a licensing system for headwear. Just as gin had to be taxed and stamped, so too did your bowler or bonnet. Without the stamp, your hat was illegal. Contraband perched on your head. Imagine the absurdity in a society where hats were not optional accessories but mandatory signals of respectability. Every man, woman, and child walking the streets carried not just fabric and felt, but a tiny square of paper proving they had paid the crown for the privilege. A missing stamp could mean humiliation, fines, or worse. And yes, there were inspectors, sometimes called hat detectives, who prowled the streets and shops checking linings and sniffing out offenders. The cultural impact was enormous. Hats in the 19th century were more than clothing, they were identity. A silk top hat signaled wealth and status. A flat cap marked you as working class. A bonnet displayed feminine propriety. By taxing hats, the government effectively taxed class itself. To own multiple hats was to flaunt wealth not only to neighbours, but to the treasury. For the poor, even one taxed cap was a burden. This is where the law took on symbolic weight. Anthropologists tell us that clothing often functions as a ritual marker, separating the respectable from the disreputable. The hat tax bureaucratized this ritual, turning social signals into legal obligations. To be hatless in Victorian Britain was to be suspicious. To be improperly stamped was to be criminal. Respectability itself was subject to audit. Of course, as with any tax, resistance followed. People found inventive ways to cheat the system. Old stamps were carefully removed from worn hats and sewn into new ones. Underground markets sold unstamped hats at lower prices, often in back alleys or hidden stalls. Satirical prints from the time mocked shadowy dealers whispering, "Psst, want a hat? Genuine felt, no stamp, don't tell the inspector." It was contraband, but instead of opium or smuggled silk, the crime was millinery. From a psychological perspective, the tax reveals the Victorian state's obsession with appearances. Jung might say the hat symbolized the persona, the outward mask one presents to society. By taxing it, the government quite literally monetized the persona. Every stamped lining was proof that your mask had been approved. It was not enough to appear respectable, you had to pay to appear respectable. Historiographically, the hat tax lingers as a textbook example of fiscal overreach. Lawmakers introduced it to refill the treasury after costly wars, but they underestimated the backlash. Poorer classes, already burdened by taxes on windows, salt and soap, saw it as another insult. For them, the hat was not luxury, but necessity, protection against rain, soot, and the grime of industrial streets. To make it taxable was to turn survival itself into revenue. Symbolism studies shed even more light. The hat had long been associated with authority, crowns for kings, mitres for bishops, helmets for soldiers. By forcing ordinary people to carry a government stamp inside their hats, the law blurred the line between crown and subject. Every citizen's head became a little treasury office, a walking reminder of state power. Archaeology even preserves traces of the tax. Surviving stamped labels can be found in museums, fragile scraps of paper hidden in old felt. They are relics not of fashion, but of bureaucracy. Each one testifies that someone 2 centuries ago paid for the right to wear what society demanded they wear anyway. These scraps of paper, mundane yet absurd, remind us how law seeped into the smallest corners of life. The legacy also included cruelty. For poorer families, the burden sometimes meant going hatless, which in Victorian society was almost unthinkable. A man without a hat was seen as destitute, untrustworthy, even immoral. Children without hats were pitied or mocked. Thus the tax deepened class divides, marking the poor not just by their worn clothes but by their bare heads. Satire flourished. Newspapers lampooned inspectors who peered into hats, as if searching for state secrets. Cartoons depicted men stripped of their dignity for a missing stamp. In the public imagination, the law became ridiculous, a symbol of how far the government would go to wring pennies from its people. Jokes compared the hat tax to taxing shoes, gloves, or even hair. Why not a beard tax? Some quipped, not knowing that Peter the Great of Russia had already tried that a century earlier. By the early Victorian period, pressure mounted to abolish the tax. Critics argued that it encouraged smuggling, punished the poor, and achieved little revenue compared to the administrative hassle. In 1811 the law was repealed, but the stigma and the memory lingered well into Victoria's reign. People continued to joke about hat detectives, and the absurdity of stamped linings remained part of popular memory. The ghost of the law outlived its enforcement. Paranormal folklore even fused with it. Tales of phantom inspectors checking hats on foggy streets, or of cursed unstamped hats bringing misfortune to wearers. Whether believed literally or not, these stories carried the moral that the state had once reached into even the crown of your head. The larger lesson is about control. The hat tax reminds us that no object is too small, no custom too ordinary to escape the attention of lawmakers. What people wore, how they presented themselves, even how they sheltered from rain, all could be regulated. And while the law was eventually repealed, it left behind a suspicion that government would always find a way to tax identity. Picture it, London, 1805. A gentleman struts down Fleet Street in his polished top hat. An officer stops him, fingers tugging at the lining. No stamp. A fine is issued. Across town, a boy hides a flat cap under his coat, hoping to avoid the inspector's eye. In the evening, satirical prints mock the madness, but the fines keep coming. Respectability has been monetized, and every forehead bears the burden. The Victorians inherited this legacy of absurdity. Even if the tax was gone, the memory endured, a reminder that laws are not always about justice or safety. Sometimes they are about the sheer audacity of power, the ability to turn style into revenue. And in that audacity lies the strangest truth. In Victorian Britain, even your hat was never entirely your own. 6 feet under regulation, burial laws, and the bureaucracy of death. In life, the Victorians were policed at every turn, how they dressed, when they drank, what they did on Sundays. But the reach of law did not end with death. Even burial, that most solemn of human rituals, was tightly regulated. Forget eternal rest. First came paperwork, inspectors, and a tape measure to ensure you were properly 6 feet under. By the mid-19th century, Britain's cities were drowning in the dead. Industrial expansion, poor sanitation, and high mortality rates meant churchyards filled quickly. Graves were reused, bodies stacked like cordwood, sometimes buried so shallowly that heavy rain brought bones to the surface. Accounts describe dogs digging up remains, coffins collapsing into nearby houses, and graveyards so overcrowded they resembled grotesque compost heaps of humanity. The public was horrified, but horror alone did not bring reform. It was fear of disease that finally did. At the time, the reigning medical theory was miasma, the belief that foul vapors rising from decay caused epidemics like cholera. If corpses lay too close to the surface, they were thought to leak poison into the air. Parliament responded with a series of burial laws beginning in the 1850s. These required new cemeteries to be built outside city centres, graves to be dug at least 6 feet deep, and coffins to meet certain standards of construction. The rules turned funerals into legal events. Grave inspectors, yes, that was a real job, had the authority to measure depth, examine coffins, and even halt burials that did not comply. Imagine a grieving family gathered at the graveside only to have an official crouch into the hole with a ruler, announcing, "Not deep enough." Regulations on coffin materials added further burden. Cheap wooden boxes were frowned upon, sturdier coffins were encouraged, which meant higher costs. For poor families already scraping together pennies for a burial, the laws often forced them into debt. The symbolism here is profound. Anthropologists see burial as one of humanity's oldest rituals, marking the passage between worlds. By inserting inspectors and rulers into that process, the Victorians transformed sacred ritual into bureaucratic transaction. Death was no longer only a spiritual matter, it was a civic one. The state claimed the right to govern even the final journey underground. Psychologically, this reveals the Victorian fear of disorder. Jung wrote of death as the great archetypal threshold, something societies surround with symbols to manage anxiety. In Britain, that symbol became 6 feet of soil. It was not just a measure of depth, but a measure of control. If the body was hidden deep enough, then perhaps death itself could be kept at bay. The tape measure was a talisman, warding off chaos. Yet the laws carried cruelty. The poor, unable to afford private plots, were often buried in mass graves, paupers' pits where dozens of bodies were layered one on top of another. Families sometimes sneaked loved ones into these pits illegally, only to face fines when discovered. Others carried coffins across town in the rain. To reach approved cemeteries, turned away from parish yards that had closed under the new laws. The final insult was cost. Dignity in death became a privilege of the wealthy, while the poor were subjected to regulation without reprieve. Historiographically, burial laws also reveal how memory is shaped. Reformers presented them as victories for public health and decency, and in some ways they were. Urban graveyards did pose real risks. But the lived experience of the poor tells another story. Laws that piled financial burden on grief, laws that turned mourning into yet another arena of state intrusion. Archaeology brings chilling confirmation. Excavations of Victorian cemeteries show layers of bodies interred hastily, sometimes with multiple coffins crammed into a single grave. Others reveal the attempts at regulation. Rows of graves precisely measured, coffins reinforced with iron or lead. In both cases, the soil speaks of how law left its mark on death itself. Comparative religion adds contrast. In ancient Egypt, elaborate tombs reflected a belief that the afterlife mirrored earthly order. In Rome, burial outside city walls reflected both sanitation and ritual separation. The Victorians combined both impulses, health fears and moral symbolism. The 6-foot rule was as much about purity as about science, a way of separating the living from the dead with measurable precision. Folklore also grew around these regulations. Tales circulated of officials exhuming bodies to check compliance, sometimes relocating the dead to proper cemeteries. Ghost stories blamed unrested spirits on shallow graves or hasty burials. In a society already fascinated by seances and hauntings, the idea of bureaucratic ghosts, souls disturbed by paperwork and fines, became part of the cultural imagination. Conspiracy theories thrived too. Some accused burial boards of profiteering, using regulations to funnel families into private cemeteries owned by businessmen. Others whispered of collusion between undertakers and inspectors, profiting from upgraded coffins and deeper digs. Whether true or not, the perception was clear. Even in death, money talked. The absurdity of it all was not lost on contemporaries. Satirical journals joked about grave detectives, men who treated funerals like crime scenes. Cartoons showed inspectors with rulers measuring corpses, or officials debating coffin thickness while mourners wept. It was bureaucracy at its most surreal, sorrow reduced to a checklist. Picture it. London, 1865. A family gathers at a graveside. The priest intones the words of burial. An inspector interrupts, ruler in hand, declaring the grave 1 foot too shallow. Workmen are ordered to dig deeper, while mourners wait in the rain. The coffin, simple pine, is criticized for being too flimsy. A fine is threatened. The family, already impoverished by illness, bows under the weight of law. Death, which should have been the great equalizer, becomes just another way to measure inequality. The lesson is unsettling. The Victorians believed that order could be imposed on chaos, even on mortality. By regulating graves and coffins, they tried to sanitize death, to turn it into something manageable. But death resists. It seeps through soil, through memory, through fear. No inspector's ruler could truly contain it. What the burial laws reveal is not just Victorian bureaucracy, but a deeper truth about human history. Societies often try to legislate against fear. In this case, fear of disease, fear of decay, fear of disorder. Yet in doing so, they often create new suffering. The poor were humiliated, the grieving burdened, the sacred made profane. The state reached into the grave itself, proving that in Victorian Britain, not even death was beyond regulation. So if there is one strange, haunting takeaway, it is this. The Victorians measured morality not just in kisses or hats, not just in Sundays or pubs, but in inches of soil above the dead. Eternal rest was conditional. 6 feet under was not poetry, it was policy.